Okay, Fesca Maholdinge. Thank you very much to you all for coming and good evening. We've had a wee gremlin with our settings tonight, I'm afraid. So cameras have automatically been set to be off when you come in. This is being recorded. So if you're happy to be part of the recording, please feel free to put your camera on. But if you'd rather not be part of the recording, please just keep your camera off. It's the opposite way round to normal. So if you want to be in the recording, please feel free to put your camera on. So welcome to everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. It's nice to see so many people here, especially nice for me because I'm from the area, so it's nice to see us getting a good turnout on my own patch. My name is Sally Reynolds and I am one of the Scottish Land Commissioners. I work over in Carloway with Urusau the Carloway as my day job, and I actually live on the Isle of Lewis and Galston. I know many of you that have already come in, but for those of you I don't know, very good to meet you tonight. As I said, this webinar will be recorded. We will start in just a couple of minutes with our presentation, and then we will go into questions. We'll have plenty of time for questions, and we will finish no later than 8:30. I'm a stickler for time on these things, so I can promise you you'll all get away for a cup of tea by 8:30. Our privacy notice, there is a link in the chat and there's also a link on the slide there. You'll find it on our website. So please do have a look there if you'd like more information. We'd love to hear as many questions as possible or comments. We've set this up not as a webinar, but as a meeting. So you are very welcome to use the raise hand function or, just wave and we will bring you in if you'd like to speak. Or please feel free, if you'd rather not do that, to put a question in the chat box. Please also use the chat box just to chat amongst yourselves about stuff. We find that happens quite a lot in the meetings. We won't have the answers to all the questions, but more importantly, we are here tonight to listen. We want to know, what the issues are in the Western Isles, how you're feeling about land reform. It's really important for us. We do these right across the country, and it's really important for us to find out stuff. So please do be assured we're a listening ear tonight. If you don't want to come forward with something tonight, but you have a burning issue, it comes to you tonight or it comes to you tomorrow, please feel free to get in touch with me or one of the other commissioners or direct to the commission staff, and we're always really pleased to hear from people. At the end, we'll have a survey to gather some feedback. Please do give us your feedback because we can only make these events better and form them into what we want to see if we hear what you want. So tonight, I'm here as one of your land commissioners. I'll be chairing this evening. Andrew and I have swapped roles for tonight, so I'll be chairing tonight's meeting. Andrew Finn, who is the chair of the Scottish Land Commission, he'll be giving a presentation in a minute, and we're also joined by Lauren MacLeod, who I know many of you will know as well, another one of the commissioners. And we're also joined by Gemma Campbell, who is also from the Western Isles, so we're well represented tonight. She's one of our members of staff and she's part of our good practice team, so she's really well placed to answer a lot of questions. In the background we have Jess, who's doing all our technical support and keeping us right, and as we go through the night, as the topics come up, Jess will share relevant links in the chat. And Jess is keeping us right, so big thanks to Jess for that. So as I said, the format of the evening will be We'll go to a presentation which Andrew will take us through, and then we'll come back together for questions. The majority of the evening will be that time for questions and discussions. So if you think of questions as you're going through, pop them in the chat or speak up later. So I'll pass over to Andrew now and let him do the presentation.
Sally, thank you very much.
Sorry, Andrew, you're muted.
That's okay. I don't know what went wrong there. I apologise. I thought I'd clicked the right button, but I'm not brilliant at these things. Everybody knows that, I'm afraid. So thank you all very much indeed. I'm going to take you through a wee presentation. It won't take very long, but maybe 15 minutes or so. What I'm attempting to do here is just give you a very, very quick sketch of who we are, what we do. It's necessarily relatively superficial, but it'll give you a good feel for that. So let me just try and do this, and hopefully it'll all work fine. Now, why is it? Oh. There we go. So Scottish Land Commission set up to advise the government on land reform and to take forward the government's priorities on land reform. But let's just be clear what land reform is about. Most people, when you say to people land reform, most people think about big estates, the big scale, the fact that Scotland has probably the most concentrated pattern of ownership in Scotland. Under 500 people own half of Scotland, which is an extraordinary statistic when you think that there are about 5 million Scots. So an incredibly concentrated land ownership pattern. Everyone knows that, and most people know that's what land reform is about. But land reform is about a lot more than that. The last Land Reform Act in 2016 was very much about tenant farming as well, which has long been a challenging issue. And it is also about crofting. And that's a nice picture of Sally with her sheep there, which I thought I would just slot in. But there are other things, and the world's changing actually. So increasingly, land reform is actually about carbon sequestration and what is called natural capital. So hydropower and wind farms and ecological restoration, rewilding, repeopling, all sorts of things like that. New things which are challenging the way the structures we have for land ownership, land use decision making, and so on. The most pressing is almost certainly carbon sequestration. We know that Scotland could play a big part in the UK and Europe's efforts to sequester carbon. If we managed our land better, particularly, we can sequester it in peat. And if we sequester carbon, we can get paid for doing that. So there's a big and completely new economic opportunity. Something that a lot of people don't think about is that actually quite a lot of Scotland's land and the buildings on it are derelict and vacant. Not so much in the Western Isles, actually, I'm pleased to say, though there is quite a lot of croft land that's underutilised. But certainly in urban Scotland, we are blighted, frankly, by vacant and derelict land in places, particularly around Glasgow, Dundee, and many other conurbations. But there's actually there's vacant land, vacant and derelict land just 100 yards from where I live on the Black Isle, north of Inverness. So it's not only an urban issue. It's also about land use planning and the compulsory powers that exist. At the moment, local authorities do have compulsory powers, but they are limited. We may, in looking forward in Scotland, decide that elected authorities need greater compulsory powers to make sure that what's happening in Scotland and with Scotland's land meets the needs of the people. And so it's very much about that. Most people know that one of the early pieces of land reform legislation of the new Parliament in 1999, it actually came through in 2003, was access and a right of responsible access. That's land reform. Seems to be working reasonably well, not without its wrinkles, but it is broadly working. And most people know that in the Western Isles in particular, that land reform is perhaps one of the most striking features of the last, 20 odd years in the West. Certainly since I worked for what was the Highland Board and Highlands Lands Enterprise, community ownership become very powerful. 75% of the Western Isles now in acreage terms now in community ownership. But what we forget is that community ownership is not just about big scalps of land. Increasingly in Scotland, you're seeing communities taking over all sorts of things. That's just down from where I live. The community's taken over the public toilets and doing a lot better job than the local authority used to do. But communities have bought bridges, they've bought cinemas, they've done all sorts of extraordinary things. Land reform, I think, increasingly in the future is going to be about new kinds of ownership and new kinds of tenure, different structures. And that's actually my granny's hut. My granny was a hutter. And between the wars, this new thing grew up of hutting, where people entered into agreements with landowners to build huts and they paid a ground rent. Unfortunately, hutting never had the statutory security of tenure that, for example, crofting had. And what actually happened to my granny's hut, and I remember it well, is that the landowner came along one day and said, I don't want this here any longer, and you're not paying me enough rent. And he put a match to it. And it's probably one of the reasons why I'm sitting here today, actually. It was a deeply upsetting experience at the time for everybody. And lastly, tax and financial support are hugely important issues in land, and therefore are central to land reform as well. Many people will tell you that that actually owning land is quite a good way of avoiding tax. And I certainly have met people who have told me that the reason they own land is because it's quote unquote tax efficient. That means it's a good way of avoiding paying tax. And of course, financial support is hugely important to people who own and manage land, including people who tenant land, like crofters. So getting that right is hugely important. And land reform is not a new thing. We've done it for a long, long time. The Crofting Acts in the 1880s were probably one of the most fundamental pieces of land reform that we've seen in the last 150 years in this country. And we keep on doing it, and we will keep on doing it, because we have to constantly evolve legislation, policy, and all the rest of it, tax. We have to constantly evolve that to fit with evolving circumstances and changing circumstances. Nobody thought 20 years ago that land prices, that the price of a peat bog would be soaring because you can sequester carbon in it, for example. And it's not always easy, and you know, we will get it wrong sometimes. But sitting on our hands and doing nothing is not an option. So we need to keep moving. The Scottish Land Commission, that's us, we were created by Parliament in 2017 because there was a feeling that land reform wasn't happening fast enough in Scotland, and that it wasn't as well thought through as it could be, and that Scotland actually needed to step up a bit. And it needed, therefore, a small, focused, dedicated body that would advise and help to make sure that Scotland accelerated land reform, to keep up with what was happening, to keep up with change, to advise the government most certainly, and that is our primary job, and to advise Parliament most certainly. The commissioners, including myself, Sally and Lorne, were all appointed by Parliament, to advise Parliament most certainly, but also to provide advice to people who own land or people who tenant land as well, trying to help them. So we're a national organisation, and you'll have to forgive us because by definition, a national organisation looks at things across the country, and Scotland is actually a very diverse country. So some of the things we appear to be attaching priority to may well be not that relevant to the Western Isles. But what we do is hold a public meeting every month somewhere in Scotland, so we get a really good sense of that diversity. And we're also a very wee organisation. There's only about a dozen staff or so based in Inverness, and I'm pleased that we are based in Inverness and not Edinburgh or Glasgow. But we are very small, but we do our best to punch above our weight. Parliament put in place in 2016, and I think this is enormously important, an absolutely fundamental concept that was put into law in Scotland. It doesn't exist in England. It was put into law in Scotland, and it was this, that you cannot own rights in land separate from also taking on the responsibilities that go with that. So if you have rights in land, you have also taken on responsibilities. You cannot separate those two. And that's hugely important, and it underpins pretty much everything. And I think it will be increasingly influential in Scotland as people grapple with that and grasp it. I think before 2016, a lot of people thought in terms of their rights, and you still hear it. I hear it all the time. I hear it from people who own land and people who tenant land. They're very keen to tell me about their rights. And my response is, with land rights go responsibilities. It's a fundamental concept that underpins everything we do. Every 3 years, we agree a plan for the next 3 years. And the reason for that is that we're a small organisation. We cannot do everything at once, and we need to focus. So we agree a plan with the government. They're elected. They're the democratically elected decision makers for the country. So we set out what we think we can do in the next 3 years, and they tell us if they like that. If they think we've got it wrong, then they tell us that too. And that plan and what we propose is based on these public meetings more than anything else. And the current plan we're working on is made up of these three parts. And we are now just starting to think about the plan from next autumn onwards. So this one will come to an end in the autumn, and we'll be into another 3 years. So everything that you contribute this evening is contributing to that thinking for the next 3 years. I'm just going to say a bit about what we're working on at the moment, though. So land rights. So people have rights in land as owners, as I said earlier. And part of land reform is reforming the nature of those rights. So we're looking at these things at the moment, and we're trying to develop advice. So one is trying to develop a more diverse pattern of land ownership and tenure in Scotland. It's very highly concentrated, I've said that already, but it's also very dominated by a kind of black and white, you either own it or you don't. In other countries, it's much less black and white. And in fact, crofting is probably the only truly form of sort of shared governance, shared ownership, if you like, that we have in Scotland, possibly the small holdings legislation as well, but it's quite marginal. So we are also working to develop new ownership and governance models that might widen the range of people who can be involved in land rights and who can exercise land rights. If you go to other parts of Europe, you'll find that one person owns the right to grow trees, somebody else owns the right to hunt, somebody else owns the right to have sheep, and so on and so forth. And these rights are much more shared. And it's interesting to think about how could we evolve from the crofting model, which I think is a good starting point, actually. And this third thing about human rights is really important and really interesting, because in the Human Rights Act, which is Westminster legislation, not Scottish, but is based on the European Convention on Human Rights, in that act, the right to the peaceful enjoyment of your property is built in there as a human right. And that's a good thing. We're a property-owning democracy. We want people to invest in property because that's how we drive up productivity and drive our economy. So property rights are very important, which is why they're built in. But it also creates a situation where the bigger your checkbook, the deeper your pocket, the more property rights, and therefore the more human rights you can acquire. And that's uncomfortable. And government and parliament have said to us very clearly, we want you to think harder about how we achieve a proper balance between property rights which we acknowledge are important and the other economic and social and cultural rights that we all have. So that's quite challenging for us, but it is, again, one of these sort of fundamental things we're trying to get right. I want to say a bit about the concentrated ownership, land ownership and the land reform bill, though I'm not going to say a lot about this. The government launched a consultation on new legislation, which it intends to publish in the spring, I think. I'm expecting it anyway in the spring. There will be a new land reform bill. So it'll be Land Reform Bill 2023, likely to become an act by 24 probably, which is very specifically focused on this issue of concentrated land ownership, the fact that so few people own so much of Scotland. And it's based on work that we did 2 or 3 years ago, and advice that we published. It's all there on our website if you want to see it. And it's about power, because what we said to government was, look, of course, on the face of it, it's about the fact that less than 500 people own half of Scotland. But it's actually about the fact that very few people exercise a lot of power in Scotland. And that at a local level, one person can exercise an extraordinary amount of power. And that is very similar to monopolies in other bits of the economy. And on that slide there, if you can read it, it's quite small, but you know, we've given the comparisons with banking or supermarkets or energy, where we regulate these industries very, very tightly. We do not allow, or we try not to allow, power to become too concentrated. But in land, we allow one person to own, well, not very far from Sally, an entire island, and exercise a lot of power. And that's uncomfortable and may well not be in the public interest. And on top of that, we allow people not to apply for those positions through competitive interview and recruitment, but by birth, and that's uncomfortable. So the Land Reform Bill will focus on this issue of concentration of power. There's been a detailed consultation. I hope you've responded, but please keep an eye on that. Essentially what it's doing is it's going to seek to define what a large holding is, and it's suggested that in much of Scotland that might be over 3,000 hectares, but it's also suggested that in certain localities like Highlands, it might be a good bit less than 3,000 hectares, because the issue is power, it's not the acreage per se. So I think that legislation is going to be enormously important, and getting it right is very difficult because we are regulating property rights, and those, as I've said earlier, are human rights, so it will be difficult. A wee bit about responsibility. I said earlier that you cannot own property rights without also taking on responsibility. So we've done, we're doing a bit of work on that, and it's based on that fundamental concept. And Gemma in particular is the brains behind a lot of this. So we've been putting together and publishing what actually the Chief Executive of Scottish Lands and Estates described as the script that landowners should follow. So that was quite powerful for her to come out with that. But we are essentially saying, look, if you own property rights, then here's your responsibilities. This is what you should do. And we are publishing, we're calling them protocols, but there's other things, there's toolkits, there's guidance and stuff, which set out and say, look, this is what responsible looks like. This is, if you're going to own those rights, then this is what you take on as well. And then we're working with owners and advisors and community and others to help them get it right. Gemma's out there all the time doing that. She's just done a brilliant job on Run with some difficult situation there. And it's getting traction, but we're still some way from it. You know, a lot of owners find this a difficult idea. They think they just own rights. And it may well be, in fact, I'm quite sure it will be, that in the new land reform bill, owners of bigger chunks of land will find that these are not just sort of guidance, these are going to be mandatory. Tenant farming is not that relevant in the Western Isles, so I'm just going to skate over this, but in some parts of Scotland, it's a major source of conflict between landowners and the people who are actually using the land to produce cattle or sheep or grow things. And in 2014, I was asked to chair a sort of inquiry into all this, and the conflict was appalling. There were terrible examples of atrocious behaviour, manipulative behaviour, even bullying. So we recommended as a group that there should be the creation of this specific thing. There's a tenant farming commissioner, so that was created. Bob McIntosh is the current holder of that post. He produced these codes of practice, which are mandatory. He can investigate alleged breaches of those codes. He can bring in professional mediators when there's squabbling. And he's also added, in addition to this, something that I think is very important, which is he's taken on or set up a completely new program to try and bring new people into this tenanted sector to try and get us away from very entrenched practices and so on. And communication, I think, is one of the things we've done. Probably one of the things we've done reasonably well, actually, is that our communication has been strong. We have spent a lot of money on it, but it's quite clear to us that if we are going to expect people to fulfill their responsibilities, they've got to know what their responsibilities are. And it's quite, you know, that takes a lot of reach. There's an awful lot of people out there with land rights in one form or another, many of them with their heads in the sand. So we've got to really shout at them, and we do our best, and it does seem to be working slowly. A wee bit on the third area, which is land markets. So some markets for land actually don't work very well in Scotland. And one of them is the market for vacant and derelict land. So you've got huge scalps of land in some parts of Scotland, which are completely unused, which are just a complete blight on local communities. They're mainly in urban areas. They're not only in urban areas. They include old buildings, old military buildings, all sorts of things. And trying to address that and unlock it and get that land brought back into useful purpose that benefits communities has been a big priority for us. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it because it's not hugely relevant to most of the Western Isles. I do want to talk about housing. We've done a lot of work on land for housing. It was one of our very early priorities. And I don't have to tell people from the Western Isles that housing is one of the biggest issues constraining the development of not just rural Scotland, but actually the whole of Scotland. Access to housing, access to land for housing. We've published a lot of advice, primarily what we try and distill it down. What we've said is, look, The current model, which is a speculative model, where people who own land bring land forward for planning permission if they want to build houses, means that in effect, a relatively small number of people who own land control what happens in the housing market. Because if they don't bring the land forward, then they won't get planning permission and the houses won't be built. And what we need is what happens in many other parts of Europe, where local government, which is democratically accountable, has much more power to say, right, we're going to go ahead and we're going to allow housing there. We don't have to wait for the landowner to decide if he wants to or she wants to. I mean, that's the guts of what we said. We've done. There's a lot more detail in it as well, but it is important work. To be honest, I think there's more to be done still. I think, you know, I foresee a need for significantly tougher reforms in relation to housing going forward. And tax, I'm not going to talk a lot about this because it's quite detailed stuff, but we have done some quite robust work on tax. We could do more. It is a powerful tool, there's no doubt. Taxation can really influence what people do. We've given two main recommendations. One is, look, there's a lot of, over half the nation's wealth is tied up in land. That's an extraordinary statistic. And yet relatively little tax is paid on that wealth. So we do think that we need that further work needs to be done on taxing the value tied up in land for the benefit of everybody. And secondly, we need to look at other options for tax reform that would drive recovery. So let's take a very obvious issue in rural Scotland, especially the Western Isles, which is second homes. Let's think seriously about how we might tax second homes in order to achieve clear public interest objectives. That would be another example of the kind of thing that we might want to do going forward. And there are others. Natural capital and the carbon thing is changing very, very fast. Land values, where there is the potential to capture carbon, are soaring. Big companies are buying it. Brewdog, if you drink beer, you'll know who Brewdog are. They bought a big estate purely to plant trees and capture carbon and offset their carbon emissions. There's big insurance companies and other big institutional and speculative investors are buying land where they think they can trap carbon and sell carbon credits. So that's changing very, very fast. There's a big risk that actually the only people who benefit from that are big corporate investors, people in London, that won't actually benefit Scotland and local communities at all. So government has charged us with thinking really hard and really fast about this, to advise on how do we ensure that there is public benefit and there is local community benefit from this investment, and what does responsible look like in this context. It's not all about rights, contrary to what some investors seem to think. So we're working on that. It's not going to be easy, but we're working hard on it. I want to say a very brief word about crofting, because we're in the Western Isles. I think I have to say, the Crofting Commission is the Scottish Government's lead advisor here and the regulator. And that's right, actually. I mean, the majority of the board is elected by crofters. And that's the way that Parliament has decided to deal with crofting issues. So we do not have any great remit for crofting, and it's not been a dominant issue in our plans. That said, the legislation is fiendishly complex, and it's pretty questionable whether it's now entirely fit for purpose. And reforming that legislation, there's land reform. So, we watch all this very carefully, and we meet from time to time with the Crofting Commission board, and I'm now one of the government people on that board. The soaring prices for crofts undoubtedly are a big challenge. They brought the lawyers into play in a big way, but older problems are still there too. Absenteeism, abandonment are there too. So there's some big issues in crofting, which are land reform issues, primarily responsibilities of the Crofting Commission, but ones that we certainly watch. What we do know, and what we do, if we had a crystal ball, there's no question that kind of small scale land tenure, call it a small land holding, call it a croft, but something that's regulated, so that people can have security and can put down roots and bring up a family and all these sorts of things. That kind of regulated small-scale tenure could undoubtedly have significant value for the whole of Scotland and for our future priorities around land reform. So, you know, you can look at crofting and you can think, oh, it's all just so difficult. There's a big backlog, prices are soaring and all the rest of it. But then you can look at it, stand back from that, get in your helicopter and say, ah, yes, but if we had a really good working model of small scale land tenure in Scotland, it could achieve a lot. So there's a lot in there, actually, I think, for the future. That's about enough from me. Just a couple of things on where you might get more information. So we've set up this new online hub where you can go and learn more about, you know, what people are actually doing at a community level. And I think it's good because, you know, you can see people are doing extraordinary things all around the country. And precisely because Scotland is so diverse, those things are diverse too. So the My Land Scot thing is really interesting. You can find out how to get onto that from our website or just Google it. There's a podcast which is part of that, which goes out every month, and some of them are pretty provocative. Dan McGarvey, you may have heard of him. He's quite a well-known social commentator. He did one. That's that one there, where he really focused on sort of inequality and derelict land and all that kind of stuff from his point of view, and it was quite moving, quite powerful stuff. So it's well worth going there. And our work is on this website, Land Commission Gov Scot. There's enough to cure anybody of insomnia. There's so much there, because we've been going for about 4 or 5 years now. We've published a lot of stuff, and there's some really, really interesting stuff there. And as Sally said at the beginning, if you do want to contact us after this evening, please use that email address. You know, one of us will be very, very happy. If you want, you know, if you'd like to talk to us privately or whatever, use that email address, say who you are, give a phone number, and one of us will get back to you. So, you know, don't feel you have to necessarily participate this evening if you'd rather do that, or if just something occurs to you in 3 days' time, use it. Sally, back to you. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Andrew. I hope that was really comprehensive, and I hope everyone kind of learned a bit more. Some of you may have been to similar sessions in the past and heard some of it before, but our work is always evolving, so it's always great to get an update and kind of remind ourselves about, kind of take that step back and remind ourselves about the wider land reform journey. I'm going to ask the other members of the panel, so you've met myself and Andrew. I'm going to ask the other 2 members of the panel to give a very brief introduction of themselves just now before we kick off with a question. So I'll just pass to Lauren just now.
Hey, good evening, everyone. My name is Lauren MacLeod. I'm one of the land commissioners, and I'm based in Oban. I've been involved with land reform over the last 30 years. Prior to being a commissioner, I was the chairman of Community Land Scotland, which is the representative body for community landowners in Scotland, and I was also a co-opted board member of Star Azúis for 6 years. So really looking forward to hearing the questions, the discussion this evening. Thanks, Sally.
Thank you. And Gemma?
Hi, I'm Gemma Campbell. I'm the Land Rights and Responsibilities Manager at the Land Commission. So my team's work really focuses around the land rights and responsibilities. So we're responsible for the protocols and guidance that you've seen links to tonight, as well as training, workshops, casework, advice and support for stakeholders. And I also do a bit of work on community wealth building and funding for community ownership. And as Sally alluded to earlier, I am originally from South Uist, although based in Inverness now.
Thanks, Gemma, and thanks for joining us tonight and giving up your evening. It's great to have you with us. We haven't got any questions yet in the chat box or any hands raised. Now, I know enough people in the audience to know that you're not all shy and that there's definitely people here that will have questions or comments or something to kick off conversation. So anything to open with, and if not, then I will pass to Andrew or Lauren for something. No, okay, you're all being quite shy, which is quite unusual. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to pass to Andrew. As he alluded to earlier, there's been quite a lot in the news recently from the Isle of Rum. So I'm just going to pass to him for a very brief comment on that, because I'm sure there's many of you in the audience who are very interested in that case. And as another island. We're always kind of interested in that news.
Yes, Sally, thanks very much. The RUB case is interesting. I mean, it's interesting in itself, but I think it's interesting for what it says about the future of the way we might think about land and buildings in Scotland. I mean, what happened on RUM is there's most of the island belongs to the Scottish Government through Scottish Natural Heritage, or Nature Scot as it's now called. But some years ago, when I was chairman, actually, through an asset transfer, the community took over ownership of the village, and that's been really powerful. There's affordable housing, there's a bunk house, there's all sorts of things happened. And I think more important than that, it changed the psychology of that from being a kind of company island, an SNH island, to being a proper island with a community that actually had a future, and so on and so forth. So that was really important. Then recently, SNH, you know, they also own the castle. It's falling down. It's massively expensive to repair. It's pretty questionable whether that's a good use of public money. And so they, I think, advertised, but in any case, they got into a situation where they were in discussion with an extremely wealthy guy who was willing to buy it off them for very little and restore it and put it into a sort of heritage charity and then run it as a hotel. The problem with all that was that the community didn't feel it had been adequately involved at all. And importantly, that the fact that the only people there for the really long term are, by definition, the local community. The local community do not go away. Individuals may, but communities don't. And they contacted us and said, look, this feels uncomfortable. We're losing control of something. And so there's been lots of discussion, meeting with the minister, and I'm pleased to say the minister said, look, let's just slow this down and get this right. But what I think is really interesting about it is, you know, the idea that bringing in private money, I mean, private money is a good thing, and bringing some in is a good idea. What you don't want to do is, in the process of bringing in private money, hand over all the power, and that's what we've tended to do too often in Scotland. In this instance, a private individual helping to set up a charity to own the castle, putting a big chunk of money in. There will be tax relief on that, so the taxpayer will put a big chunk of money in as well, and the local community are the only people with a real long-term interest in that. So there is a real potential now, and it's under discussion, to create some sort of tripartite ownership and governance structure that collectively owns and manages that castle in the interests of the island and the interests of the wider people of Scotland. So it's moving towards something that I think actually has a lot to say to the rest of Scotland, and Gemma's and others are helping to make that happen, but it's not there yet.
Thanks, Andrew. And we now do have a couple of questions, and we've got a hand raised. So I'll just go to a couple of the questions in the chat first. So Mary Schmoller from Storage Sewage, thanks very much for your question, Mary. I'm actually really sorry to hear that you've been stuck in the village since last Friday. And I was also very sad to hear some other sad news from US today. So it's really, really difficult time, and our thoughts are with everyone involved in that. Now, this is a question about how do we get help to address climate change? I've been stuck in my village since last Friday, and I think this is about us. And I actually had a conversation today where we said we never thought we would see the effects of climate change in our lifetime. When we were younger, it was kind of an abstract thing, and we genuinely are. And Gemma and I were in a meeting yesterday where we heard a really interesting presentation about adaptation. So I was just going to pass to Gemma for a wee bit of conversation on this, and just then some links possibly to our good practice programme as well, and good stewardship of land.
Thanks, Sally. Yes, I was about to mention the sniffer project that we heard about yesterday. They had kind of recognised that a lot of the discussion about climate change at the moment is about carbon capture and about carbon credits, when really the focus needs to be on that adaptation and resilience and these kind of things, like the flooding in South Uist at the moment, which I thought was nothing like I'd seen in my lifetime, but my mum assures me it's nothing like she's seen in her lifetime. And yeah, they are taking forward, Sniffer are taking forward work commissioned by Scottish Government to work directly with landowners and communities to explore what they can do to tackle climate change. So if you are happy with that, Mary, I could pass your details on to them, because they are recruiting people to work with over the next little while.
Thanks. I'm sure we'll get an answer in the box. We're now going to pass to, oh, she's saying yes, please. So that's great. So they're looking for landowners to work with. So I think actually South Uist would be a great example of a community to work with. So we'll put that, we'll make that happen behind the scenes. We're going to pass now. We've got someone with a hand up. So Donald McKinnon, over to you for a question, and then we'll come back to the ones in the box.
Thanks, Sally. Thanks for the presentation, Andrew. I think that was really interesting and interesting to look at land reform in the broadest sense of it as well, and to look at all the different things that it encompasses. But I want to go back to maybe the sort of traditional perspective that we might have of the sort of large scale concentration of land and the community ownership, and which is, you know, so strong in the Western Isles, and we're now at what, close to 70% of land in the Western Isles in community ownership. But that process has pretty much stalled here, and in a lot of parts of the Highlands and Islands. We're not seeing the large scale transfers of land that we maybe saw in the last 10 years and earlier than that. So I was wondering if the panel could maybe comment a bit on why that may be, and maybe split that up into two separate questions on whether the legislation that exists at the moment is fit for purpose. I'm thinking about around the Crofton community right to buy, and possibly touch on the Bernera example there. And the other point is around the rising value of land, and whether the model that we have at the moment for taking land into community ownership, where communities are expected to pay market value for these estates and assets, is a sustainable one going forward, and whether we need to look at a new model there. Bearing in mind the things that you mentioned in your presentation, Andrew, about the rights of landowners and how we negotiate those going forward. Thanks.
Thanks, Donald. Nice, easy question to keep us going there. So I'm going to ask Lorne to comment on this. He's probably got a lot of experience, having seen a lot of those, have been involved or seen a lot of those buyouts happen. So I'm going to pass to Lorne. I am feeling a wee bit more positive following the successful the results of the ballot in the Bays of Harris. So hopefully we are going to see a few more coming. But over to you, Lorne.
Yeah, thanks, Sally, and thanks, Donald. That's a good question, because perhaps we haven't been seeing over recent times the large-scale buyouts that we did see maybe over a decade ago. One of the things I find is quite interesting within the proposals that have been consulted upon from the Scottish Government on the new land reform bill is that there will be a requirement for some of the large landowners to have a prior notification of a sale to communities. And I think that would be helpful, because as part of our other work has found, there are so many off-market sales going on, and that has increased over the last year or so, I think as a result of natural capital and other such like. I think another factor in a slowdown of some of the purchases, and I'm talking maybe wider than just the Western Isles, throughout the whole of Scotland, are of course the huge increase in price of land. I think we're talking about in the last 12-month period, an increase in the value of land of the order of 70 to 80%, and that's in just 1 year. So that has made it sometimes more difficult because obviously support, say, from the Scottish Land Fund and also fundraising can be very difficult. Having said that, like Sally, there are quite a few signs of optimism, particularly in the south of Scotland, a lot of interest in the borders and Dumfries and Galloway, so hopefully things will come forward there. But you are right, there's obviously been a slowdown at the moment, but hopefully with the Bays of Harris and maybe with other things coming in the pipeline, things will improve. So I know your question had a lot of aspects to it. I'm sorry I maybe missed the end of it, but I'll hand back to Sally, and you can come back to me if they missed the latter half of it.
Thanks, Lauren. I think that's given us a good overview. We've got quite a lot of questions now in the chat, and I'm going to come to Andrew with the next one. Donald, if you feel we missed too much there, we missed a section of your question, pop it in the chat box or pop your hand back up and we'll come back to it. I'm going to come to Andrew now because we've had a few questions here about crofting. And a lot of this is possibly not within our gift, but I thought it's worthwhile just opening the discussion to talk about it. So, and it's really interesting to say, so Neil Barker's put a question in there, and it's really interesting how he's put it, because he's talked about with crofting allocation should come responsibility. And so that leads us right back to the land rights and responsibility statement and our good practice work. So is there plans to create parity in the way absentee abandoned croft land is treated? So I just over to you, Andrew, for that. We've also had quite a few questions. We've also had some questions about the cost of crofts. They're leading into housing questions as well, which I'll come to next, but just in case you want to touch on both of them just now, Andrew.
Yeah, so we better be careful not to turn this into a crofting commission meeting. Happy to talk to, well, I'm not, I will be at the SCF conference tomorrow if people want to talk to me. So very briefly, if I stand back from the detail of this, I think the central issue is that the legislation is now so complex and so difficult to administer and so expensive to administer that it's becoming almost impossible. So there's a massive backlog. So if we were to, there's a huge amount of absenteeism, a huge amount of abandonment, where the legal powers exist to deal with that, but in practice, we're not dealing with it. And I think, I don't see that being sorted anytime soon. The Crofting Commission is dealing with the best part of 2,000 regulatory applications a year already. And frankly, it's barely got the resource to do that. We've recruited a lot more people, we're training them up, we are beginning to get on top of the backlog, but I think we have, let's be clear, it is a very difficult set of circumstances. For what it's worth, and I'm going to now look at this through a land reform lens, for what it's worth, I think that over the next probably 20 years, I think we have to take a long-term view. I think we need to rethink what are we trying to do in Scotland with small-scale, regulated, secure tenure, which is what crofting is. What are we trying to do with that? And what are we trying to do with it at a Scottish level rather than just a crofting counties level? Because the logic in the 1880s that created the crofting counties, if indeed it was logical, and there's a question mark, frankly, in my mind about whether it was ever logical, certainly doesn't make an awful lot of sense now. So I think we need to stand back, be clear what we're trying to do, and then produce legislation that is actually fit for purpose, which doesn't solve the problem short term, but frankly, I don't think it can be solved in the short term. Sally, if you don't mind, I'd like to just link that to two of Donald's points, if that's okay, because I think it links quite well. And the 2 points that Donald made was, is the legislation, this was the right to buy legislation fit for purpose? And I think we need to recognize that both with crofting legislation and the right to buy legislation, the elephant in the room is the Human Rights Act. And the European Convention on Human Rights, ECHR, that's the elephant in the room. It protects very strongly property rights and the owner of property rights, and for good reason, actually. But what it means is that in practice, and you've seen this with Bernera, in practice, it is extremely difficult to use compulsion to address issues like community right to buy, like absenteeism, like abandonment. Because using compulsion can trigger a defense based on the Human Rights Act, which takes you into extremely expensive legal territory. And increasingly, because land values are soaring, croft values are soaring, it is more and more worthwhile to employ a clever lawyer to defend yourselves in the courts. And that is one of the things that is causing the Crofting Commission a great deal of difficulty, and it is one of the things that is making community ownership on a compulsory basis much more difficult. So the second part of Donald's question, I think, is in many ways the nub of it, which is this issue of the rising price of land. Land values are soaring because land rights are in Scotland so relatively unregulated. In other words, you can do stuff if you own land rights that is, you're relatively free to do what you like, and that causes land to be, that's why it's so expensive. And to illustrate that, I spoke to a Danish landowner recently, not the one you might think actually, but another one. And I said to him, why are you buying land in Scotland? And he said, I'm buying land in Scotland because I can do stuff here I can't do at home. And that makes the point. So what I think we really need to think about in Scotland is much harder thinking about land rights, about the way in which we regulate land rights, we limit land rights, we share land rights. And if those land rights will over time, I think, potentially become less valuable, if the public interest has a greater say, the community interest has a greater say. And that will take 10, 20 years. It won't be easy, but I think that's the direction of travel we need to go in Scotland. We are far too liberal in the power we allow to go with land rights. There you are, that's controversial.
Thanks, Andrew. I think Andrew enjoys it when we swap places so he can get in more controversial chat. So I'm actually going to go on that point, and because both Donald and myself and Andrew mentioned Bernard, I'm actually going to go to a question now from Joanna George, who's mentioned there don't seem to be any responsibilities to adhere to for the absentee landlord regarding Bernard. Now, I think this is a really pertinent question, and I think it really brings to the fore our kind of the land rights and responsibility statement as it is just now. And it brings up that question of is voluntary enough? We've seen a big culture change through our good practice programme, but does it go far enough? And this is a really big topic and one to open up. So I'm going to ask Gemma now to expand on some conversations about our good practice programme and just sort of open that up.
Thanks, Sally. Just for full disclosure, before I joined the Commission, I worked for Highlands and Islands Enterprise delivering the land fund. So Bernard was one of the first communities I supported through the land fund processes, and it pains me that they're still going through this process all these years later. And I'm very aware of some of the difficulties that have been faced over the years. In terms of rights and responsibilities, we have made an approach. We've offered support and guidance to help the landowner in that situation, but it has not been taken up. And it is something that we would like to see more landowners take up. But we do have a situation at the moment where the land rights and responsibility statement is voluntary. So we can only work with people who are willing to work with us to help them understand their rights and responsibilities and what kind of good practice in land ownership looks like. There's obviously a proposal coming up with a bill to bring in a statutory basis for land rights and responsibilities. And as Andrew mentioned earlier, there will be a threshold on that, but there are discussions taking place on how that might apply in an island context, take into account things like concentration of power, which I think we would see here. So it is something we are continuously working on, and you know, there is that kind of awareness there that there does need to be something with a bit more power behind it and a bit more of a regulatory approach for those who aren't willing to engage.
Thanks, Gemma. And this is something that I've heard Lauren talk about on many times. I just wondered if you wanted to come in on this at all at this point, Lauren.
I think it's a good point that's made in connection with Bernard there. Obviously, we've got the example for many years, our Tenant Farming Commissioner had codes of practice, and he had additional powers which were embedded in the Land Reform Act 2016 to intervene where these codes are not abided by. The same is being proposed in the new land reform bill. As Gemma says, the proposals coming for landowners over 3,000 hectares, but there will be also arrangements in place in island circumstances. So there will be potential for intervention, because encouraging people to adhere to best practice doesn't always work. It will work with many, but not with all. So I think we need an underpinning with legislation, and the proposals that are in the land reform bill would give additional responsibilities in law to individuals such as the one we're referring to. Thank you, Sally.
Thanks, Lauren. It's a really interesting topic, and I did meet with Joanna Ann, another development officer from Bernard last week. We had a good catch up on this, and I do hope that it's a long time coming, but I do hope that things looking forward, there is a way forward, or things are looking a bit better towards a way forward. And I know they had a community meeting this week in the EGM, and I hope that went really well. I want to move on now to housing. Now, housing is by far the topic that brings the whole of Scotland together. It doesn't matter which meeting we go to in Scotland, there is always at least one question about housing, but those housing issues can be very, very different in different parts of Scotland. So we face very different challenges here potentially to other parts of Scotland. But I would like to just spend a little bit of time of this if we can. And I think Abby's asked a really pertinent question, and so has Agnes talked. Now, obviously, the price of land comes into this, but the other, and I'm going to paraphrase your question a little bit, Abby. So Abby's talked about, will the reform strengthen community landowners' voice when it comes to planning recommendations? Now we don't have power over planning or influence over planning. Sometimes I wish we did, and sometimes I'm very glad we don't. But I think what the beginning of Abby's question that I really like is that she's talking about housing being such an issue, and community landowners know their land, they've got the knowledge, they know where the possible feasible sites are, but I think sometimes it's just, how do you get across the next step? Where do you go next? And why, you know, how does it still feel like such a big barrier? And I know there's some exciting projects happening. I know Storis are doing some work on an exciting project, and there's someone else in the chat, David, who I know as well is doing some exciting work to do with the kind of housing issues as well. And I know there's loads of work out there, but I think it's still something that we spend a lot of time talking about, and the solutions are hard to find. So Gemma's kindly agreed to give us a bit of an overview on this, and a bit of a chat about our work. I know it's not your direct area, Gemma, so thanks very much for stepping in on this one.
It's not, no credit goes to my colleague David Stewart, who leads our work on land and housing, but luckily for me, I do have a recent update on rural housing and rural repopulation from David. And it is an area that the Commission has looked at before. We have previously published a report on land for rural housing, which argued that more support is required to enable organisations that support communities to deliver rural housing, and also made the argument for a central resource to provide expertise and support to de-risk that kind of development in rural Scotland. But he has let me know that as part of the work on rural repopulation, the Scottish Government is looking to trial a place-based approach. So they are looking for 8 to 10 pilot areas over the coming year. So the work is just beginning, but the Land Commission is feeding into that and sharing some of our findings on land and housing and place to support the communities who go into that. But I know that they're yet to be selected, so the pilot areas haven't been identified yet, but there is some work going on there. And we are also doing work in the Good Practice team with working directly with the likes of Scottish Property Federation, Homes for Scotland, looking at housing delivery. So we are trying to kind of work on the good practice side there with some of the voluntary measures. I've also had conversations recently about kind of opportunities for local authorities to get involved in housing in areas where there's market failure. So that's work that Scottish Futures Trust are taking forward, and they're working with some local authorities on that. So we are going to link in with them to discuss options. And a final point on housing, I know through work I've done on community wealth building, that Colonel Angier was one of the pilot authorities involved in community wealth building, and they had some support from CLES to create a community wealth building strategy. And one of the key areas that came through in that was around housing. So I know they're looking at how they can work with crofters and with grazings committees to identify potential house sites.
Thanks, Gemma. That's really interesting, and thanks for the overview. We've got a question now from Mary, so over to you, Mary.
It wasn't so much a question, just putting my planning hat above the parapet here. For those that don't know me, I'm Mary McKeever. I head up the development plans and marine planning team in the Corla. And I'm interested around Abby's point on community involvement in planning and planning decisions. Now, the planning system in Scotland is open for anyone to engage within, but just in terms of context here in the Hebrides, there is very, very few house sites that are refused planning permission. You know, we have a very high approval rate for consenting development, and equally we have a very permissive planning policy towards housing, especially within our rural areas and within our villages. But, you know, happy to engage further on any thoughts Abby has on that.
Thanks, Mary, that's great. And that's a really good connection to make. I don't know if Abby wants to come in now herself, or whether hopefully you'll catch up after the meeting, right, with the meeting. Abby's also kindly agreed. I've also messaged Abby regarding the climate stuff, so she's also, that's another land home we've got for the Sniffer project, which is great, because I think it's really important that the communities that are seeing the kind of impacts of climate change are involved in that project, and that we have a good spread of projects from across the country. Thanks, Mary, for coming in on that. That's it's really nice to hear someone putting their head above the parapet, and that's great. I just want to come now to this question we've had. Let me just scroll back up. About mandatory powers, and you mentioned mandatory powers in your question, Andrew, and we've got a question here from Ewan about competing pieces of legislation and how do we reconcile different pieces of legislation. So, for example, housing, we've got net zero, we've got land reform, and sometimes it can feel like things are kind of competing against each other. And this is something we come up against, not only between different pieces of legislation. You know, when we're talking about tax, we have Westminster and we have Holyrood, and you know, we can sometimes end up going down rabbit holes with these, and you know, it can be very difficult. But I thought it was very interesting with this, and with Abby's question about environment and kind of who's taking responsibility and who's feeling the effects. And this kind of leads us on to a kind of natural conversation about natural capital. So I wondered if Andrew wanted to just expand on what he talked about in his presentation a bit, on these kind of points about this.
So can I start with you? So Ewan, thanks. I saw your question too, or your point. It's actually an observation. I think it's right. And the last sentence is where I'd like to start this. So your last sentence, you say, in short, establishing primacy in terms of delivering responsibilities. And I think that is a central challenge for us at the moment. That, you know, we've come from a place where land rights were predominant. I think it is accepted across the piece that with land rights go responsibilities. That is accepted. But in practice, as Gemma says, in reality, you don't have to fulfill your responsibilities. You may make yourself a social pariah in the process, but you can get away with it. And as Lorne says, we're now moving towards a place where the large landowners will, through some sort of regulatory process, be required to fulfill their responsibilities. So I think we're moving in the right direction. But you're right that establishing primacy in terms of your responsibilities to society, to the public interest, I think we're a long way from that. And there is no easy answer. So if we take this issue of conflicting priorities, I mean, it is the job of elected governments to weigh up conflicting priorities and decide which one should have preference, and that will change over time. 20 years ago, no one was that bothered about net zero. In 20 years' time, net zero will dominate everything, absolutely. It probably should now. It certainly will. So it's not a static thing, actually. And I think, nor do I think it's an easy thing, but I think it, that's what in reality elected, let's take, we've just heard about planning. The Corley all the time weighs up competing pieces, priorities in, for example, coming to a planning a decision. That's its job. So that's specifically around Ewan's point. Sally, if I could just go on and talk a wee bit about the natural capital stuff. So what we're seeing, and we've published some reports on this, what we're seeing is soaring land prices, specifically on the back of investors and often speculators, private equity, venture capital type investors, as well as big companies, buying land because they think that in 20, 30, 50 years time, the capacity of that land to fix carbon will be sellable at large profit through damming up peat or planting more trees or whatever else. And that at the moment, because the land rights, the rights that go with that land predominate, those rights are extremely valuable. Now, what we need to do as a country is move fast and move to a place where actually the benefits that are derived from, in the short term, fixing carbon through whatever it is, tree planting or peat or whatever, that those benefits are much more equitably shared. Now, we did it with wind turbines, so let's not beat ourselves up. We can do this. When throughout most of Scotland, certainly in the Highlands where I was working at the time, as wind farms were developed, a community wealth fund was put in place, and a 25-year deal usually was put in place whereby the wind farm paid into a community wealth fund. So it wasn't perfect. I'd be the first to admit that, and I was involved. It wasn't perfect, but there was a significant sharing of benefit. Now, we're not there yet with carbon, and that's partly why land prices are soaring so much. But we need to do that, and our very small staff, this is one of the top priorities for our staff, to try and find and recommend to government quickly tools that will enable this value to be properly shared, particularly with local communities. Government's made it clear that that's got to be the priority, but more generally, at the end of the day, whose CO2 is it? It's a bit like whose wind is it? Because you can trap the wind and make money out of it, or you can trap the energy in water as it runs across your land and make money out of it. But whose energy is that? Whose water is it? Whose wind is it? Whose CO2 is it? There's some pretty fundamental questions, and I think there's no easy answers to this. If only there was a magic wand. But as a society, if we're absolutely clear what we're trying to do, and I think what we're trying to do is share this value fairly between different parties. If we're clear about that, then we can charge government with doing it, and government can get the message that that's the priority.
Thanks very much, Andrew. And I think you managed to link together two different questions that I chucked at you there. So that was really good going. And Ewan, thanks for that really good question. And Abby, they're both really pertinent points. I'm going to come to you next, Ewan. I don't know if it's a response or something else, but feel free to join in now.
No, it is. Andrew sort of in part answered my question with earlier comments with reference to UDHR, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. My follow-up question is in two parts, really, that there are other human rights that you could argue that could be applied in relation to housing and net zero objectives. And what was quite interesting, when Andrew was doing his presentation, he mentioned in other parts of Europe that there is greater control in bringing forward land for housing. Now, part of me says, well, surely the same UDHR applies in that case. So how can they do it and yet we can't?
Thanks, Ewan. Andrew's going to come back on that.
Yeah, so part of the answer is, Ewan, is that it's the ECHR that's the central issue. Actually, it's the European Convention on Human Rights, and a lot of European legislation predates that. So that's the main reason why there are these big differences across Europe. once that legislation is in place and then adopted into domestic legislation, which in the UK is through the Human Rights Act, so Westminster Act. Once that's in place, then you can't retrospectively unpick that. So I think that is the reason. Sally, can I just say a wee bit more about housing? Is that all right? Because I'm not sure.
Sorry, Andrew, I'm just going to interrupt you. You very much can, but I'll bring you in one more question, if that's all right.
Go for it.
So I missed a question earlier from David Cameron. Apologies for that. So Jim Hunter recently suggested that all landowners be required to allow 1% of their area to be made available for housing. Is this a possibility? And if so, how? So I'll open you up for more words on housing with that.
Yeah, so I kind of agree with Jim, but I would probably go further. So the advice we published was this, essentially, which was that in Scotland, we need to move to a place where elected authorities, whatever that is, probably the local authority, is empowered to require landowners to bring forward land for housing where the elected authority believes that that is in the public interest of their area. It might be 1%, it might be 5%, it might be 10%. I don't think we should go for fixed percents, but we should be in a place where it is not some unelected person who decides what land is brought forward for housing, but it is an elected authority that decides what land is brought forward for housing. So that's fundamental, and we've published on that already. I wanted also, Sally, if you don't mind, just to quickly touch on what I think is the other dimension to this, and it's happening in Wales, so it's interesting, and that is to try and tackle the second home problem, which is, there's no question, it's a big problem in rural Scotland. And it is not realistic, I think, nor even necessarily desirable to simply ban second homes. That would cause a collapse of house prices and might actually discourage. If prices fell low enough, mortgage lenders wouldn't lend, and that would be even more serious. So it might be totally counterproductive. But what we should certainly do is tax people's second homes at a robust level. Now, the Welsh government's already leading the way with a 200% council charge, whatever they call it, community charge on second homes, and similar thoughts is being given in Scotland. And however we do it, and I'm not an expert on tax, but however we do it, it's clear to me that we should do, and there's lots of issues, incident, I should say, about tax evasion in here, as relative and avoidance. It's, you put your second home in your daughter's name or something. So it's not straightforward, this. But I'm clear that we should be finding ways of taxing second homes robustly and using that money to enable us to bring land forward for housing that otherwise would not be viable, would not be affordable, and building homes for social rent.
Thanks, Andrew. Second homes is definitely something we have plenty of here. I'm going to just building on that. So Andrew's brought up tax there in relation to housing. And building on that, I'm going to go to Lauren next, just to talk a little bit more about tax. And I'm going to leave it open to you, Lauren, to open this up as much as you want. Now Mary asked a question, can it be kept in the country taxable for everyone? Now, I think here she is it was when Andrew was speaking, so I think she is referring to the benefits from natural capital. Yeah, she's nodding. So those kind of benefits. So rather than trying to look at specific models, could it be taxable? And then it would obviously be going into the public purse and helping everybody. So over to you, Lauren, with that kind of specific question to kick us off. But please do expand, because we've done a bit of work on tax, and it comes back to Ewan's point again about balancing legislations and different responsibilities. So,
yep. Thanks, Sally. It's a good point, Mary, about tax in relation to natural capital. Actually, the work we did in tax kind of predated all the various, the precedent that's been given to natural capital at the moment. But I think that is something that's of great importance. Maybe just to outline the kind of work that we did, we brought together an expert group over a year to look at tax in relation to land ownership. And part of that was post-COVID, because we were wanting to ensure that there wasn't more vacant and derelict land. So we came up with various recommendations. to incentivise the use of vacant and derelict land, but we were also looking at concentrated land ownership. We came up with a proposal that many of you will be aware, and this comes back to people who have have more than one property. They have to pay an additional dwelling supplement of 4% on any subsequent property that they purchase. And we talked about the possibility of the government looking at a land and building transaction tax in relation to concentrated land ownership as one way of maybe not only generating additional income for the exchequer, as it were, in Scotland, but also for encouraging less concentrated land ownership, diversification of land ownership. One of the difficulties, I suppose, in working with tax is there's always unintended consequences. So you have to be very careful when making recommendations that there isn't a subsequent thing further down the line that wouldn't be as beneficial. One of the other aspects is that a lot of the taxation that really could affect land ownership, I think we're talking about inheritance tax, and we're talking about agricultural property relief, business property relief, are very much reserved to Westminster. So perhaps we can't really have the expectation of a big changes coming from our recommendations regarding that, although we have highlighted what we would like to see happen there. So there's a lot involved in tax. You're very right to raise that point, Mary, and certainly in relation to natural capital, in addition to trying to encourage community benefit, I think there may be the additional string of looking at taxation direct. Finally, before I stop, I should mention also land value tax. And one of our recommendations in that regard, and many of you will know, a land value tax is a tax on the unimproved value of land. What we had suggested was not to go as far as that full implementation at this stage, but perhaps that could be targeted. And one step towards that was to bring on all land onto the valuation roll so that it would be easy for government in the future to target a land value tax at specific things. It could be like a derelict land or whatever. So I'll maybe just stop there because I'm conscious of time. Pass back to Sally.
Thanks, Lauren, that's great. We've got through most of the questions, so if anyone's got any other anything else they would like to bring up, please do share it in the chat box or pop your hand up or wave and we'll bring you in. I just very quickly managed to catch up with Joanna there offline to check, and really pleased to share that the Great Burn of that AGM went really well this week and had a really good positive meeting. So we're all really we're all wishing you all the very, very best, and we hope you get on well with your next steps. And there's many people in this room I know who have been through that process, some shorter, some longer, and we're all looking forward to hearing how you get on and hoping you do get on well. I'm going to come back to Gemma now, as we don't have any questions. I'm just going to ask you to share a little bit about our current webinar series that we have called Land at Lunch that we're running over the winter months. So we do lots and lots of different comms, and they're all based around different audiences. Andrew mentioned My Land and the podcasts in his presentation, and I'd highly recommend that. I'm sure some of you heard me tell this before, but the podcast is one of those podcasts that you put on and you think, I'll just stick my headphones on, I'll listen to this, and I'll just, when I'm cooking or I'm doing the dishes, and then you end up stopping because you've done something, you've missed a wee bit, and you've got to go back and listen again because it's so interesting, and you end up finding you haven't done any cooking or any dishes, and you're just engrossed in the podcast. So I highly recommend podcasts. They're really interesting. There's a lot of diverse topics. But as I was saying, our comms is all focused on different levels of knowledge and different types of stakeholders. But this new one that we've got is for those with a kind of less knowledge on land reform. So I was just going to ask Gemma to give us a quick bit of introduction about it.
Yeah, sure. So we are currently in the middle of our first block of our new Land at Lunch series. So the Land at Lunch series is designed just to be really quick, kind of 45-minute sessions where you can hear a kind of informal presentation about various topics and ask some questions. So so far we've had sessions on the updated land rights and responsibility statement that was published in September, one on how to find out about who owns land and what they're using it for, and one today on opportunities for community ownership. So we've got a few more coming up between now and Christmas. They're every second Wednesday at 12 o'clock. So the next couple will be focused around natural capital. We also have a bonus webinar coming up in a couple of weeks' time with the King's and Lord Treasurer's Remembrancer, KLTR, talking about a consultation they've got ongoing about a project to give communities a bit more access to ownerless land. So that'll be a really interesting one. So I will, I see my colleague Karen has popped a link in the chat for our events page there if you want to sign up to any of those.
Thanks very much, Gemma, and thanks, Karen, for popping that in. And that actually sounds really interesting. And again, that's a question we get really regularly about when there is no owner, what happens next. So yeah, I've listened to a couple of those Land at Lunch webinars and really enjoyed them. So I highly recommend it. It's a great thing to do when you're eating in your lunch break. Now, David McGrath has asked if he can ask a question. So David, would you like to unmute and ask your question now, please?
Okay. I've been researching this subject for quite a number of years. The issue is always coming back to the free market. And the free market has had an uncontrolled price inflation for the past 40 years, which in any part of the economy is utterly insane. But we encourage and support in property. So I'm wondering, is it possible community land trusts own land on behalf of the community? And if we're looking at housing as opposed to crofting, I'm not going to go anywhere, crofting is too complex for me. But when we're looking at housing, and my focus has been housing for young people leaving home and single people, and they are priced out of everything. And I speak from experience, having 2 boys myself. So is it possible where the community land trust can make a site available for living space? And we're suggesting it needs to be about, it doesn't need to be, but you know, 1/4 of an acre. And the title to the land never changes from the community land trust. And that if someone wants to live there, they have to bring their accommodation onto the site. And then when they decide to leave, they have to take it away. If they don't want to take it away, they could sell it, but they wouldn't be able to ask more than the price of a new cabin from the factory, which means we're keeping a tight rein on the capital cost, on its inflation. And in this way, because it's much cheaper to build the accommodation, when they pay off the loan, they're creating a cash equity sum rather than an inflation equity sum. And it really is just for young people leaving home or single people who aren't on the property market. But it allows, it's an alternative way of making a building site available. And that was the reason why we're specifically trying to design a solution so it's off-grid. Now, if we look at the historical land or living patterns across Scotland, we used to live all over the land, and we were cleared from the land at the time of the clearances. And today we're saying to people, you can't live in those old sites that people lived in before because they're not on the grid and all sorts of reasons. In Inverness-shire, there's a ban against strip housing and all sorts of restrictions. I think if we're going to see this, we have to change the rules of engagement. And is this an area where community land trusts could actually make the breakthrough necessary for particularly for this constituency?
Thank you. Thanks. There's a lot in there. I'm going to ask Lauren to comment on it. There's some technicalities in there which we may not have the answer to. I am going to caveat it when you talked about this particular locality, and I am going to caveat it by saying at the very beginning you said you didn't want to go near crofting, but the majority of the community landowners, if not all of the community landowners in the Outer Hebrides, all or the majority of their land is croft land. So so any developments are on croft land, either common grazings or croft. So sometimes crofting law applies there. So regardless of the type of landowner. So anyway, I'll pass to Lauren, but I just wanted to caveat with that in terms of this locality.
Oh, thanks for that, Sally, and thanks, David, for the point. I think, you know, briefly in response, first thing would be, I would encourage you to maybe get in touch with the Isle of Egg Heritage Trust. They had a proposal that was looked at some time ago. I don't know where it is at the moment. A really good name, they called it Egg Roll. It basically involved, obviously it's a community-owned island, that the young people that come forward didn't actually pay for the land up front, but it was wrapped up, it was rolled into a subsequent sale. So if they sold 10 years from now, they would pay the land at that point in time and index linked. But again, you would maybe need to touch base regarding them. I would just make the general point though on housing is obviously of so great importance in the Western Isles. The population demographics indicate, you know, we really need to get as many young people staying in the Western Isles as much as possible. That's where I think, David, your own proposals that are looking at a single person housing, the likes of the Smart Clachan proposals down in Lochboisdale, various other innovative solutions need to be looked at in addition to the work of the Hebridean Housing Partnership, Tyne, Chagall, whoever. So just hand back to Sally at that point.
Thanks very much, Lauren. And we are just coming to the end of the meeting, but thanks very much for that, David. And I think we do need exactly that kind of thinking outside the box on housing. And we need to all come together and we need to keep having these conversations about it and keep thinking these ideas and these new innovative solutions if we're going to find solutions here for us. I'm just going to say thank you very much to everyone. Thank you very much to the other members of the panel, to Andrew, to Lord, to Gemma, that was great. Thank you very much to Jess behind the scenes for keeping us right. There is a survey in the chat box. Please do fill it in so we can make things better going forward. And just thanks to all of you for coming. Thanks for participating. It was really good to have such a good group and it was really good to get into some quite meaty topics. As Andrew said, we're not, the great thing about these meetings is we get to meet more people and it's more inclusive and everyone can kind of come and join in. But what doesn't happen in these meetings is it gets to half of you go home and then the other half of you come and ask us the questions that you didn't want to ask in the chat box or in person. So if you've got those questions, most of you will find me quite easily, please do. For those of you that don't know me or don't know one of the commissioners, please contact the commission via the info email and then let us know who the question's for. The email's just gone up. Thanks very much, Jess. Please do get in touch and we'll be very happy to talk to you. We're always pleased to hear from people. Sometimes we can help, sometimes we can signpost, but it's really important for us to hear what's going on. But thanks everybody very much. Safe home. I'm sure you're all ready for a cup and tea, so go and enjoy that. Thank you very much.